going to teach you how to make a focaccia dough. It is a yeasted bread that encompasses a ton of salt and oil, and it's absolutely delicious. By the end of this video, you're going to know how to make yeasted breads. You're going to have experience making yeasted bread in your tool belt. You're going to know how to make a focaccia, because that's exactly what we're making, and you're going to know how to change up your herb profile in case you want to play around with it, because it is an incredibly flexible bread, and something that a lot of folks don't really expect but is pretty wonderful to do with focaccia is if you do a partial bake, you can actually use it as a really delicious pizza dough. So you can do almost all the same exact steps we're going to do, except right before it's almost done in the oven, that's when you would slather on your pasta sauce. You'd put your mozzarella on there, your pepperoni, your mushrooms, your peppers, anything like that, with about 10 minutes left of the oven, and you throw it back in and you've got a really, really incredible, super flavorful pizza. So without further ado, I want to dive into the ingredients we're using tonight. And we're using two different flours. We're going to use both bread flour and all-purpose flour. And it's because each of those flours serves a different purpose. Bread flour and all-purpose flour are fairly similar. Frankly, all flours are fairly similar, and typically the main difference between those flours, whether it's bread or pastry or cake or all-purpose, is simply the protein content. With more protein content, we get a chewier end product. With less protein content, we get a lighter, less chewy end product. So bread flour typically has the highest protein content in it of the flour family, while cake or pastry flour has, especially cake flour, has much lower protein contents, because you don't want a cake that is chewy like a nice fresh bread. You know, all-purpose is kind of a middle ground, and if you tried to make a bread that was all bread flour, it might actually end up being a little too chewy, a little too tough. So that's why often you'll see in recipes a mixture of some bread flour and some all-purpose, or some bread flour and some whole wheat flour. And you can play around with that mixture yourself at home to figure out what's the chewiness ratio that you prefer whenever you're making breads. So know that when a recipe calls for bread flour, it's because it wants the end product to be a little bit chewy. But if you want to play around with that, go for it. Just make sure the total measurements add up to be about the same, and you'll still get a great end product. It just might be more or less chewy than originally intended. So we've got bread flour, we've got all-purpose flour. Fresh rosemary is ideal, but this recipe also works with dried rosemary. You just cut the volume in half. You could also use thyme in this. You could use oregano. You could use all sorts of herbs that you want to mix into your dough near the beginning. And if you want later on, one trend that's been really popular on Instagram is decorating your focaccias. So what you can do is right before it goes in the oven, you can take a bunch of little grape tomatoes and put them in there, big sprigs of rosemary, and you can actually create this really beautiful canvas with your focaccia, because it's such an easy bread to make and because all these things stick to the top really well. So we're going to be using rosemary tonight. Water, but the water here serves a very specific purpose, because we need it to be warm water. Specifically, we're aiming for something between 105 to 110 degrees. And the reason we do that is to help fuel our yeast, which is the next ingredient. Now, 105, 110 degrees is kind of a narrow band, but it's basically, if you were to run your faucet and let the water hit the back of your hand, the water definitely feels warm. It doesn't feel anything close to hot. And it's better to err on the side of cooler than it is hotter, because water that's too hot will kill your yeast, because the yeast is a bacteria. Water that's too cold just means the proofing process takes longer, and that's totally fine. Some people actually optimize their recipes to take longer on purpose, because it develops more flavor in the bread, because that extra period of time allowed the yeast to work a little bit more and create a little bit more flavor in their bread, because that's where the flavor typically comes from. It's actually from the yeast or whatever rising agent you're using. Maybe you're using a sourdough starter, which is just another form of bacteria. And you give it time to do its thing, eat the sugars and some other items that are in your recipe, and then basically belch out gas. And that gas is what gives your bread rise, and it's what gives your bread flavor. So the warm water fuels our yeast. It gets it really active. Too hot will kill it. Cold is fine. You just need to let the proofing happen longer. Then we have our active dry yeast. There's a few different kinds of yeast. In this recipe, just stick to active dry. If you've got instant, you can use basically the same ratio that we've got here. We've got a little bit of salt. We use a good amount of olive oil in here, and then we are going to top it off with some flaky sea salt. It adds a really beautiful texture and flavor to our finished product. So those are all the ingredients that you need to have on hand for this recipe. The volumes are not too crazy. We need 2 3/4 cup bread flour. That's 350 grams. 1 cup or 192 grams all-purpose flour. 1/4 cup, which is about 10 grams of fresh rosemary. If you don't have fresh, you can use dried. Just use about 5 grams instead. 2 cups or 474 grams of that 110-degree water. 1 tablespoon plus 1 teaspoon or 12 grams of active dry yeast. If you're buying it in packets, it's almost 2 packets. It's just shy of 2 packets. We are using 1 1/4 teaspoon or 3.75 grams of salt. If you get to 4 grams, that's fine. No one's going to be upset. There's plenty of salt in this recipe. No one's going to notice a little bit more. 1/4 cup or 47 grams or so of olive oil, plus some more for drizzling later on. And then that flaky sea salt that I mentioned. So those are all of our ingredients. We're now going to dive into mixing this, and having a stand mixer is very helpful, but I'm going to show you, at least at the beginning, before we add the olive oil, you can do most of the mixing steps by hand. It's the olive oil step that's a little trickier, and if you really need to, you could do that by hand too. Okay, I've got my mixing bowl here. I'm just using the one from my stand mixer so that I can hook this up later when I add the oil. And I'm going to start adding my ingredients one by one. So we're going to start off with our bread flour, 2 3/4 cups or 350 grams. Ideally, especially with breads, use the weight measurement, so those grams that I mentioned will get you a more consistent product every time than volume. So then we've got our all-purpose flour, 1 cup of that or 192 grams. To this is when you add your dried herbs. So I have dried rosemary. You can use fresh rosemary as well. Just add that right in. Give this a quick mix with your hands, just so it's homogenous. You don't need to be perfect right now because we're going to be mixing again in a second. Perfect. Now, set that aside, and right now we need to get our warm water. I've got this really phenomenal kettle from a company called Fellow that lets you set the temperature exactly what you want, anywhere between 100 and 112 degrees, which is boiling. So I've set this kettle to 110 degrees so I can get the exact temperature that I want. I'm just going to measure out the 474 grams, about 2 cups of that 110 degree water. Perfect, 474. Okay, then we just add our water to the flowers and the rosemary or whatever herbs you're using. I made this last night with thyme. I did the same exact thing, and it was delicious. I just find rosemary definitely carries a lot more flavor than thyme does. So you could use the dough hook in your mixer to do this. I'm using one of my favorite tools in the kitchen, just a bowl scraper, partially because the dough hook doesn't always do a great job of catching all the flour in the bottom of your vessel. So I'm using my bowl scraper to really make sure everything gets mixed nicely. And we're just doing this until we catch all that flour in the bottom. And you can even use your hands if you want for this, or a wooden spoon, I suppose. It's not all that picky. And we're not worried about kneading the dough right now. We're not trying to build up the gluten per se. We are just catching all of the flour. So it looks like there's no more flour pockets at the bottom, which is great. Clean that flour off your hands. When you're baking, when things get dough on them, it's better to either let it soak in the sink for a while, say if there's a dish, if you're not going to be washing it for a while. Let it soak in the sink for a while so that the dish does not get all hard, because this dough will get super hard and turn into almost concrete on surfaces. So you're also frequently just rinsing your hands to get dough off. Now we've got to this stage, all we do, there's even some dough stuck on the side. All we do here is we take our yeast, again this is 12 grams of yeast, and we sprinkle it on top. Just sprinkle it evenly. We don't need to mix it right now. Sprinkle it right on top, and then we let this sit just as it is for 10 minutes. So set your 10-minute timer, let it sit. You don't have to do anything right now, just sit for 10 minutes. And at the end of 10 minutes, what we're going to do is we're going to bring this over to the stand mixer. We're going to add our salt, and then we're going to mix that in until it's fairly homogeneous. We're going to then mix the whole thing for a few minutes to do our gluten development. Then we're going to slowly add our olive oil. The reason we don't add the salt yet, normally you would have added all the dry ingredients before adding the wet. You'll notice salt has not been added yet. The reason for that is salt actually retards or slows down the yeast activity in bread. So often in breads, your salt will be added after the yeast, and it just gives the yeast a little bit more time to become active and kind of do their thing. So I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Our 10-minute timer just went off, and if you feel the size of your bowl, you'll probably feel there's still a little bit of heat here, which is great. It's that heat coming off the water. That's what we want. It's going to keep our yeast active. So now is when we finally add in our salt. So sprinkle that right in. And then we pull out our stand mixer. And this is where we develop most of the gluten in our dough. Now gluten is simply a protein. I'll make sure you get a nice view there. Gluten is a protein that helps hold our bread together. So what we're going to do, lock that in place, and we run this about medium high for 3 to 4 minutes. So let it stir a little bit to incorporate the ingredients. And then turn it up. We'll let that run for about 3 minutes. So gluten is simply the protein structure that helps hold all of our bread together. Without gluten, your bread would fall apart, it wouldn't hold on to air bubbles, and when those bubbles would expand in the oven, they would simply rise out of all of the other ingredients and disappear. And you have a very dense, very hard bread. It wouldn't be very pleasant to chew. So gluten creates the structure that traps those air bubbles and then allows the bread to rise and become big and light and fluffy and delicious. Okay, so our dough rather, has been beaten around for several minutes here. We've been building up some gluten. This is a fairly wet dough again, so you can still see that, but you can see how now it's sticking, and if you pull it, it has a lot more structure to it and becomes a lot stretchier. And that's what we want. We want the dough to be nice and stretchy. So feel free to scrape down the sides of your bowl right now. Just make sure everything is incorporated. There we go. And next up, we're going to slowly drizzle in our olive oil. I want to get that dough back in there. There we go. So we're going to slowly drizzle in our olive oil. So lock it back in place again, and we're going to keep the speed of our stand mixer pretty low. When you're looking at your stand mixer, you're either going to be on the stir setting, maybe the 2 setting. So I'm going to actually start with the stir setting. And this is where we slowly drizzle in our 1/4 cup of olive oil. And this is a very slow drizzle. And we're going to let the mixer slowly incorporate that olive oil into all of the dough. And it's okay if it seems like the center is getting all of the olive oil and the stuff on the sides isn't. If that keeps up, all we're going to do is scrape down the sides and put that dough on the sides back into the mix. So when you're doing this, you want to run it at these speeds for about 1 to 2 minutes. I'm going to up it to the 2 now that I've got a good amount of the olive oil in there already. I've got a little timer here running for 2 minutes. I'm going to just let this go and mix in all of that olive oil. So we're about a minute into this mixing, and as you can see, there's some stuff on the edges that isn't quite getting incorporated. So just take a quick pause from the mixer and scrape it down. Or if you don't have a scraper, just grab a spatula and just get it all up from the sides and keep going. You don't even really need to add more time to your timer since it's such a quick process. Okay, our 2-minute timer is seconds away from finishing, but I wanted to call out something that just happened there, and you're going to see it happen again in a moment. All of our dough became cohesive and turned into a ball and started to pull away from the sides. That's actually the perfect sign that your dough is ready to move on to the next steps. When it can create its own cohesive ball, pull away from the sides, and stick to the beater. Now, I already saw it happen. I don't necessarily need to wait for it to happen again. I already know we've got all of our olive oil mixed in, so we can move on to our next steps together. And this step is the one that scares people the most, but is really the easiest. And it's the thing that scares people is they don't know when something is done proofing. And the problem is every kitchen has a slightly different temperature, and that slightly different temperature will get you different proofing times. So when a recipe says proof for 2 hours or until doubled in size, and you see it double in size in 1.5 hours, you question, wait, am I supposed to let it rest for another 30 minutes or should I start working it now? The volume of your dough is more important than the time frame that was listed in your recipe. So always go by your visual and physical cues when it comes to bread. Also, and I'm not sure if it'll work with this focaccia because it's such a wet dough, but for most breads, you can check when it is done proofing with something called the poke test. Now we can't do it now because it hasn't proofed at all. But what you do with the poke test is you just take 2 of your fingers and you poke in your dough and you see whether or not the dent you just made comes back. If it comes back instantly, your bread has more time to proof. It's not yet ready. If it doesn't come back at all, it means your bread is overproofed, it's gone too long, you can still bake it, but you'll probably have a fairly dense loaf. What you're aiming for is something that takes a few seconds to slowly fill back out most of the way, maybe not entirely refill that dent that you made. That is the sign of perfectly proofed bread. So you want it to visually double in volume and pass the poke test. Now, you can leave it in this bowl if you like. I'm going to transfer mine to another large bowl. I'm going to oil it real quick so that if their dough sticks to the side, that could actually inhibit its ability to rise inside this bowl. So I'm just adding a little more olive oil here, oiling up the sides of the pan, and then I'm going to scrape the dough out of this bowl into this bowl, cover it, and then you can let it sit at room temperature for about 1.5 to 2 hours. Room temperature meaning 75 degrees or so, or until doubled in size. And as I just said, doubled in size is the more significant measurement here to keep track of. So if it doubles in size faster than that, start working with it after it's doubled in size. And then once this comes to the full proof, I'll show you what it looks like. You're going to be blown away how much volume we got out of this thing. But before that, so throw it in here. Just swirl it around a little bit to make sure the whole thing's covered in oil so we don't have any sides that might stick to something. And now it'll be uninhibited in its rise. If it hits the side of the bowl, everything's covered in oil. It'll rise right up and not get stuck. Also, similar to why we oil the bowl. So we oil the bowl because if it was dry, some of the dough might stick to the sides and then it would get stuck. And then it couldn't rise because it being stuck is actually a more powerful force than the gas slowly being built up on the inside due to yeast. Now we cover things when we want it to rise, because if we didn't, little drafts rising and flying by over your bowl can do two things. One, it can cool it off. So if it cools it off too much, it's going to slow down that bacterial reaction that we get from the yeast, and it's going to take a lot longer to proof. It will still proof, it just takes a lot longer. The other thing that happens, and it's slightly more devastating, is the top could dry out. And if the top dries out, it becomes hard and crusty, and that hard crustiness is stronger than the gases your yeast can create, and so you can't actually get that rise because the top locks itself into shape because it just dried out. So we use some sort of cover, whether it's a slightly damp towel misted with a little water, or some plastic wrap, or even shower caps work extremely well because they're very reusable and very easy to put on top of your bowl. What this does is it just stops your dough from getting a dry skin on top due to drafts, and it helps keep it from cooling off too quickly. So I'm going to let this proof for 1.5 to 2 hours, or until doubled in size, and then I will come back and join you to show you the next steps in making your absolutely delicious rosemary focaccia. Look at that beautiful, bouncy bowl full of dough. Now, before we dive into this, it's very important that I call out, you should preheat your oven now to 375 degrees Fahrenheit convection, or fan as I often call it, because it's engaging the fan in your oven. If you don't have a convection oven, set your oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Do that now so that your oven is at least pretty close to the right temp by the time we're done prepping this. And if your oven still needs to take a little while to heat up, it's okay if this sits out on the counter for a few minutes before it goes into the oven. There's plenty of olive oil on top, it won't get a skin. So we need to take our cover off, and you can see this definitely doubled in size. It's a really sticky dough, so I can't quite do the poke test on this. If I get a little olive oil on my finger, I might be able to. You can see I can poke it and it doesn't bounce back immediately. There's a lot of air in this guy, so we probably don't even need to worry about it at all. It is definitely ready. So get out your baking pan. So this is a half sheet baking pan. Line it with a sheet of parchment paper, and then what we're going to do is we're going to just drizzle a little oil on here, spread our dough onto this, spread it out, create those beautiful dimples that focaccia is known for, and a little more olive oil on top, sprinkle it with some salt, and it goes right into our ideally preheated oven. So let's add a little olive oil to this bad boy. And I don't need much. The olive oil serves two purposes here. First, it keeps your bread from sticking later on. So some folks would use like a non-stick cooking spray for that. But if you use non-stick cooking spray, you don't get the second benefit, which is this olive oil is going to soak into the bottom of your dough and make the bottom really delicious and a little bit crusty and just phenomenal. Also, most cooking sprays are terrible for you, so just avoid them. And do almost anything else you can to make things not stick, other than actually using a non-stick cooking spray. So once again, I'm taking out my handy dandy bowl scraper, and we're just transferring all of this beautiful dough to our pan. And then from here, we're going to stretch it out. Now, the easiest way to stretch this out, get a little bit of that olive oil on your fingers, and we're just poking to try to sort of guide it into the shapes that we want. And if you need to, you can lift it up and stretch it a little bit. but the poking tends to be a little more effective just because we're trying to move a lot of mass from the center, and it's such a wet dough. Now, if your fingers are sticking at all, just get a little more olive oil on them. It doesn't need to be perfect shape or perfect rectangle here. If it doesn't perfectly go to the corners, that's fine. One of the beauties of focaccia is it's just a fairly organically shaped bread. So at this stage, I'm going to actually put more olive oil on top, just a light drizzle, because we want this to cook into our focaccia as it bakes. And then we do the dimpling. Now there's already kind of some dimples here due to how we stretched it, but all we do is we kind of lightly press our fingers in here. And if you see little air bubbles popping up around where you press your fingers, that's totally fine. That's a great sign that your proofing went well. So we just dimple it a bit, and these dimples create little pools for our olive oil to kind of chill in during this baking period, to just really soak in there and give us a beautiful, flavorful, crunchy crust. And then, final step before we throw this into our oven, get some beautiful flaky salt and sprinkle that over the top. You can be fairly generous with this. If you're nervous, you could go light, and then we're going to potentially add more after it comes out of the oven. Just know that when you sprinkle it after it comes out of the oven, the salt won't stick to your bread quite so well. It will be a little bit crunchier, but it won't stick. So a lot of your salt will hit the top and just bounce right off. So my oven still needs to have a couple more minutes to warm up. While it's warming up, I'll explain what the baking process looks like. So I'm going to throw this into a 375-degree Fahrenheit oven when it's on convection. Again, the difference between convection and standard ovens is convection just simply means there's a fan blowing in the back of the oven to try to get more even heating going on. Often that will create faster cooking. It'll give you better browning on a lot of things. Standard ovens just have a heat element at the bottom, and all the heat rises from the bottom to the top. Many ovens have the option to do either or. You could have it run on standard mode or convection mode. I refer to convection mode as fan because standard and convection aren't always clear. Convection and conventional are sometimes how they're referred to, and those two words are way too close to each other. So instead I say fan and standard. So fan is convection. You've got that fan moving the heat around. If you don't have a convection oven and you're reading a convection recipe, simply boost the temperature of your oven by about 25 degrees. That would be about right to make sure that everything bakes the same time frame. If you're going the opposite, you are taking a regular recipe that had a standard or conventional oven and you want to use convection. Maybe you want a little more browning going on, but you want to bake it or cook it in the same time frame. Simply drop the temperature by about 25 degrees when you set it to convection or fan, and you'll get about the right results for the same time frame. So for this recipe, 375 fan or 400 standard for 20 minutes. At the end of that 20 minutes, you want to rotate your dough, throw it in for another 10 minutes. After that, we're going to take it out, throw it on our counter. We're going to actually brush on even more olive oil and sprinkle a little more salt on top. Let it cool for about 10 minutes, and then you can dive in. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal. I can't wait to show you what this looks like when it comes out of the oven. So again, you want 20 minutes, one direction, 375 degrees Fahrenheit with the fan going. That's convection. After 20 minutes, rotate your pan like so that we get even heating. It's not as big of a deal with a convection oven as it is a standard oven, but it can still make a difference in some ovens. Some ovens are better at convection than others. Rotate it, give it another 10 minutes. That really makes sure we get good browning on the surface here. Then take it out, we're gonna let it cool. While it's cooling, we brush on a little more olive oil. I'll show you exactly what that looks like. And you can feel free to sprinkle on a little more salt at that time as well. Okay, I will see you in about 30 minutes after you've baked your focaccia and it comes out of the oven. Yeah. That is one beautiful focaccia. This just came out of the oven. It is still piping hot, so be very careful. As it is still hot right now is when we actually want to brush on a little more olive oil. But really, if you can't tell, infusing a ton of olive oil flavor into this bread. So I'm just using a little pastry brush. If you don't have a pastry brush, you could use a paper towel. If you're really in a pinch, they make some silicone pastry brushes as well to just brush them on. You could even just pour a little bit on and then maybe give it a minute before you use your hands. Brush on. The pastry brush is the ideal. And we don't need a perfect coat. Just get some on there while it's still nice and toasty. Part of the benefit of this is it helps the top be a little bit sticky again, just the tiniest bit. Maybe sticky is not even the right word, but it allows things to adhere to the surface a little bit better. So we're going to sprinkle a little more salt on in just a moment. And that salt's going to stick better because we put this olive oil on there. It also gives the bread a really nice, beautiful shine. If you notice when it first came out, it was a little bit dull. Adding just a little bit of a shine to it just makes the bread that much more appetizing to the eye. And I don't know if you know this, but the more attractive you can make a dish look to the eye, the more flavor the brain actually interprets from that dish. So that's why plating a dish and making it look very beautiful is actually such a big deal, and why high-end restaurants put so much effort into that. You actually interpret the food as tasting better because it is presented to you in a nicer way. So I'm going to sprinkle a little more salt on top. Now there's a good amount sprinkled on top already, so I'm going to be fairly light with this. And at this point, you are done. Let this cool for about 10 minutes. Remove it from the pan, slice right in, get these really long, beautiful slices. If you want them to be very attractive to the eye, cut them in strips and then in diagonals, and you'll have these really beautiful pieces with large air bubbles strewn throughout, soaked in olive oil, plenty of salt on top. It's absolutely phenomenal. Like I said, you can also take this, well, actually, before I even go there, I want to just stop and celebrate the fact that you got here. You got to the point where you made this beautiful yeasted bread. You may have never even made a bread with yeast before, when you walk away from your oven with a beautiful golden olive oil soaked, salt studded focaccia that's going to blow your mind as soon as you take a bite in about 10 minutes. And I want to take this moment to just say, like, you freaking rock just for getting to this point. And if you're just watching the video right now and you haven't cooked it yet, you still rock because you watched the video and you got to this point. And I can't wait to see when you do get around to cooking this bread or baking this bread, because you're going to love it so much you won't be able to stop. Now that we've celebrated your awesomeness, I want to point out that at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that you can use this to make a pizza dough. Now, the way you would do that is when we bake this, we put it in for 20 minutes. We rotated it at the end of that time frame and we put it in for another 10. What you would do if you were using this for pizza dough is you would bake this for 20 minutes, take it out of the oven, put all your toppings on, your sauce, your cheese, pepperoni, your mushrooms, your peppers, what have you, and then throw it in for the last 10 minutes. Your edges will still get fairly crispy because they should probably still be a little exposed. The center won't get quite as crispy, and then you don't need to worry about brushing olive oil on the top. At the end, you've got plenty of sauce on there. But most of the bottom of the crust will still be really nice and crispy. You'll still have the really big air bubbles in there because the sauce didn't weigh down the dough during that first 20 minutes or so. So that's another way you can use this. Before you put it in the oven in the first place, you could put little halves of grape tomatoes in there and seeds and big sprigs of thyme or rosemary and make beautiful designs. Just do a quick search on Instagram and you'll find tons of beautiful focaccias. But as it stands, it's a simple bread that's stunningly delicious, easy to make, and it is infinitely flexible.